scientists and people who had been kicked out of their university jobs, and she says, come and live in Zlín, and we will do research and experiment. So here we have two architects, Bohumír Kudla and Hinek Adamec, who worked in the Batya design office, and they were given the project to experiment with prefabricated panel construction. And what I want you to see in this image is very thin vertical prefabricated panels. The right side of the building has been stuccoed and plastered over, styrofoamed over with this new technology, so ignore that. But the building, both sides, used to look like this series of panels. And these are hollow panels, and they have a structural support, like a ribbon around the center, that holds them together in a frame. But the panels themselves just kind of line up and sit in the frame. So here is something about the way that this was built, and you can see them here in this picture. This is a little bit later, but just by a couple years. The panels are a little shorter and wider now, and you can see the construction technology actually used a crane that went in the street, and it was lifting the panels into the frames. And then when the crane goes away, they pave it over and it becomes the street. But it's a kind of transportation core for these buildings. And these are called type A duplexes. And I just want to reinforce at each of these steps that the architecture that's being made is identical in floor plan to buildings that existed in Zlín and later for the Paneláks. It's just made with a different construction technology. So the traditional brick-made Batya duplexes have the same floor plans, the same proportions. This is just a new technology for making the walls, essentially. So that's the origin point. So here's the floor plans. They're very modest. I won't talk too much about that. Here's the prototype for the first prefabricated apartment building. This is not a Panelák because the panels themselves are not structural, but this was an experiment where the panels are wrapped with these ribbons that are holding the building together because it was basically threatening to fall apart. And these are my students with me in 2008 walking by this building. And at the time, the funny part about the image for me is that I didn't know that this building was very important to my research, and I just happened to snap a picture of it with my students walking, and then I was looking through my Zlín stuff and I realized, oh my God, this is the building. So you can see here the panels. You can see, sorry, I'm gonna walk up here. The line of the panels, that's the width. So this is not the first Panelák, but it's a panelized apartment building, 1949. So here's a Czech building construction textbook. Shows the 4 stages of construction. They call them system 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can see that system 1 is large block construction with poured concrete floors, so kind of liquid floors. Then you see that they're experimenting with panelizing the floor systems and using masonry typical construction at the facade. And then you can see in type 3 that the panels are for the floors, the ceilings, and for the facade, but it's still a stick construction system, so there's still a structural skeleton, like a traditional building. And then the ultimate pinnacle of all this work is to try to get to system 4, which is a skeleton-less panelized building that has no sticks in it to make the skeleton. So here we have Karl Janu, who's already come up as the guy from the Architectural Working Group, the guy at the Osiedlovací úřad, the first head of the Czechoslovak Building Works. What does he do when socialist realism is the official style and he's gotten kicked out? He goes to Otrokovice and he makes experimental panel buildings. Here's called the Janu system. This is system 2 on that diagram, and this is 1954. Here's Karl Honzík, the very famous avant-garde architect who is also writing books into the 1960s about architecture, and he's held up as being one of the architects who worked against the system. But here we have in 1954 sketches that Honzík published in Architektura ČSR for different ways to decorate an early version of a Panelák. So these are still stick frame because this is system 3. But what Honzík says is if we're going to do this, we can't just make buildings that just have totally blank panels. So let's try to be creative and let's come up with these kind of ornamentation and decoration that of course comes again from the Czech national heritage idea to liven up the facades. So a separate stream of research is happening with Vladimír Karfík, who had been the great Batya architect. He's left Zlín He's moved to Bratislava, and he is head of the architecture department at the Technical University. He gets a team together, and they do really interesting research about buildings, and they come up with a parallel system that's called the BA system. And this is interesting because it's a hybrid. It's pre-stressed concrete frame, so hopefully you can see that there are frames, and then they use liquid concrete to infill between the frame. So it's still a prefabricated system, and it's one that has some flexibility that other kinds of systems don't. Sometimes you'll hear this called a panelák. It is not a panelák because it has a structural frame inside of it. I know it's a minor issue, but for some people, if you see the two doors here, one of the problems with paneláks is the doors could only be in the plane that was parallel to the facade. You structurally couldn't put the door in the short direction. Does that make sense? Here you can see that this system allowed any configuration. The frame is what's holding up the building. The liquid panels in between can have openings. So this was a much more flexible system for architecture, which is really interesting. So here's the model that I showed at the beginning of the first G house. The G house is the very first panelák. This is system 4. And this is 1950, and this is called the G system because it was made in Gottwaldorf, which was the new name for Zlín. Here are, excuse me, the original floor plans, and here's where I want you to see the inflexibility of the placement of the doors, that all the walls that are crossing in the short direction are solid, because they are the building structure. The building structure is in those panels. If you cut into them, you mess up the building. So you can see that except where you have cores, where you have the stairs, you can put an extra door in the short wall, where these are monolithic stairs. They're part of the prefabricated construction. They're dropped in as already made stairs. So here's what they look like. This is a G40 before renovation, a G40 after a very early renovation that was already kind of peeling and falling apart. But this is the first panelák. And these are in Zlín. They're relatively near the city center. And what I want you to see in them is that their proportions, the size of the apartments, everything about them looks exactly like traditionally built buildings from the same time period. But the construction technology hiding behind there is something totally new. So here's the living core. So those of you who know about paneláks know that the kitchen bathroom and the toilet were part of a box. And that box was brought and dropped into the panelák as a single object. And here you can see a very early drawing from 1956 of the toilet, bathtub, sink, kitchen, stove configuration in the box. So the other thing that's important about paneláks is that the way that they stand up is a hook and staple system. So the panels are made with hooks, that these kind of half circular hooks that come out of the top of the panel, and then they're stapled and basically bound together, and then they have a mortar that's put into the joints. But the hook and the staple is critical. They're welded together, and this is what gives the building its stability. Here you can see these, this is an exterior panel of a G57, which is one of the next generations of the Zlín panelák. And you can see the hangers that are inside the reinforced concrete panel. So this webbing is steel reinforcing that's in the panel, and the hanger at the top is where they're going to hook and staple the building together. And here's a corner joint. They use these vertical pieces to hide these, what look like the staples, right? So these are what's being constructed here. G57s, designed in Zlín, brought to Prague, and put into this, there's 12 of them in this one site, and this is the construction process itself. And you'll notice it still has some remnant socialist realist details on it at the top of the roof and over the doorway, and that will soon disappear, but here it's like in late 1955, they still need to be doing it to kind of conform to expectations. Here you can see these gantry cranes that were used to move the panels, and you can see the vertical pieces that are the way that they stabilize the panels during the construction. And this is the buildings now. These are after renovation. And you would never know these are the very first paneláks in Prague. Nobody would ever guess. It's impossible now because they've hidden all the joints. Okay, so this is my final slide, and I'm sure I went too long, but hopefully not too long. So what is the future of the panelák? So there has not been mass destruction or failures of Panelaks in the Czech Republic. In particular, the Czech government, with the help of the European Union, has offered substantial sums for renovation of exterior and public spaces. Most Panelaks have been renovated to improve the thermal quality of the walls. They were known to be cold, difficult to heat, but energy during the communist time was cheap, so there was not a priority to conserve energy at the time. But now there is, when people are paying much more for it. So the renovations include covering the buildings with hard polystyrene. So that's this styrofoam. It's drilled into the existing facade like a coat for the building. The polystyrene is then coated with stucco and painted, and usually in very bright colors. So anyone who's seen these new Panelaks, the colors are kind of outrageous to architects. Other improvements include new windows, new elevators, new front doors, and new lighting in the public spaces. Inside, in the many individual units, residents have removed the old kitchen and bathroom combinations, the box, they've taken it out, and they've replaced it actually with a modern box with new finishes. And sometimes also removing the walls that were not structural to create more open space. There's companies that specialize in replacing that box, that living core, and if you give them your building number, you say, I live in a G57, they already have the entire specs for the size and all of the parts of your box, and they know exactly what to do to replace it. So with these improvements, there's this question of what's really left of the original Panelák. And here is Petržalka in a recent photo, which I now call part of the rainbow edges of the cities in the region. I like this picture, which I just picked up yesterday off the internet, just because it shows you how pastel and colored all of the new facades are. Those of you who knew Petržalka in a previous period, it's a little shocking to see it in this way. Also, there's a huge shopping mall that's now by the river called O Park, and a big skyscraper there. And it's put in infrastructure for recreation, entertainment, shopping that was originally part of the Petržalka plan and never built. And the existence of it now is making Petržalka not just close to downtown, but very desirable in certain ways for people, especially young families. So I think this is my last slide. So I'm going to leave it there, and I hope there's lots of questions.
One thing I was interested in, you said there's never been a failure. Now, what is the seismic situation in the former Czechoslovakia?
As far as I know, they don't have any seismic things happening.
I remember when there was that tragedy in Georgia, where they had the earthquake and there's tremendous loss of life.
Yeah.
Was that inherent in the design of a Panelák, or were those particular ones just poorly constructed?
So, when I say there's not been a failure, it's specific to the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Like, there has not been a building that collapsed. There's been a lot of roof damage and a lot of replaced roofs because the design of the roofs was deficient.
Yeah.
But the ones that have failed tended to be in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and it depends how you want to interpret it, but really it's construction quality. That's the problem. Because if any water or moisture gets, as you know, you're an architect, if any moisture gets in there, it's going to rust out the steel.
Yeah.
And so the Czech Paneláks were kind of hardy. They were, in general, pretty well made. And in this renovation period since 1989, they've really focused on the facades, which is where the water infiltration is going to happen. And so you don't have the kind of balconies. You hear about balconies falling off sometimes in former Soviet ones, and also in Romania, some of the southern European countries. So the Czech Paneláks are generally the quality of the construction was better. The maintenance situation and the understanding of what the possible problems are, I think, was a little bit better. And there have been abandoned Paneláks, like especially around factories that have closed, like in more rural areas. But as far as I know, there's only been one Panelák in the entire Czech Republic that has been taken down just for aesthetic reasons. So there are 1.08 million units in Panelák buildings, and 30% of the population live in them, and they're generally in very good condition, especially inside. I don't know how many of you have been in a Czech private apartment, but the people who live in Czech apartments that I've seen have kept the quality of the interior space really pristine. And so when you fix the outside and you fix the public spaces, you then go from what used to be a horrible public space and like, you know, no locks on the doors, broken glass in the front door, all these things everyone who's been there has probably seen. Now when it's all fixed up, it's amazing how different it is when you have a secure new front door and new windows, and the interior is still your home, and so now suddenly you live in a kind of a much more updated building. So they seem pretty rock solid. I would guess that the failures are going to happen more with the later ones, the 70s and the 80s, when the construction quality goes down and the quality of materials goes down, because of course, with the shortages of everything, labor and materials, the mixes that they were using, there's a suspicion that there are some bad mixes out there, including ones that have organic material in them. So the later ones are probably the ones that are going to go, but so far we're not there yet. So hope, fingers crossed. Yeah.
In your research, did you look into people's reactions to living in these buildings, what it was like?
So I don't do a lot of work with the residents, because what I was trying to do with my project is to understand the architectural profession. And the piece of the work that is about the residents has to do with oral histories that I didn't do but other people have done, and kind of testimonials that say that people moving into these buildings were really optimistic and excited and felt that this was a big upgrade to their living situation. So particularly like in the Ostrava region, you had a lot of people moving out of mining shacks, like these miners' communities that had no running water and no central heat, and they were in very bad shape. And they move into these modern apartments, and this is such a huge improvement to their living standard. So so there's oral histories that have been done by other people to talk to the women in particular who moved into these buildings. And they loved having spaces to do laundry. They loved the central heating. They loved that there were so many children around for their kids that they could see out their window to the courtyard where the kids were playing. They have all these kind of benefits that come with these new buildings. As the construction quality got worse, we all know the complaints about, you know, that they're drafty and cold and that you could hear everything that was happening with your neighbors. The panelaks I look at, these early ones, the dividing walls were still concrete panels, and so the issues are less severe. In the later years, they were able to stretch the technology so that fewer of the walls were structural, and they actually started to use plastic and other very thin material to do some of the dividers. And this is where you get drafty, loud kind of spaces. The very early panelaks from the 50s have very large, the rooms are generously sized, and the scale of the unit is 70, 80 square meters, usually a 2+1 kind of unit, and they're considered to be quite nice. And so to the point of how do people feel about them now, this is more of an anthropological question, and there are people doing that kind of oral history, social history fieldwork in the neighborhoods. But I was really focused in the archives and on the architects, so it wasn't such a topic for me. So yeah.
Who owns these large-size Sídliště and paneláky? What is the owner?
Who owns them? So this is a great question, and this is a question that interests me a lot. So there are 3 different ownership structures that are typical. One is city-owned. Nobody owns it. The city has to be the public owner. There's no other kind of public owner anymore. Some of them are owned by corporations that were they were spun out of national corporations. So for example, the OKD, the Ostrava Mining Corporation, spun out its real estate division, and actually it's $1 billion company now that owns all of the apartments that used to belong to the mining company. And they will not sell those units to the residents. And they've been for 20 years in the courts, in the European courts, fighting OKD about this. It's now called RPG, I think is the company. So anyway, the ownership structure is either public, but that's dwindling. The cities are selling the units as much as they possibly can. There's some social housing left for poor people. There's the corporate ownership where the residents who might have been there for 50 or 60 years could not buy their unit, and they still live there and pay rent, or they got kicked out when the rent went too high. And you also still have a cooperative ownership structure where the residents were offered from the corporation that dissolved in 1990. The residents were allowed to buy their units at a reasonable price, and now they have a društvo, this cooperative ownership structure that's something like an American condo association, but it's a little bit more community-oriented from what I can understand, and this cooperative is responsible for new roofs for the public spaces in the building, and also you have to be a cooperative to apply for government money to get facade renovations, new elevators, new windows. Only the društva, only the cooperatives are eligible. The corporations have to pay themselves, and the cities have done almost very little renovation. So you can sort of tell when the city owns something when it hasn't been fixed up still. So I don't know if that's what you're interested about, but there's some places like the Oblak, the arch building that's in Ostrava that I showed, this circular building, where each doorway is a separate house, it's a separate dome, and there's different owners. So the arch building has not been fixed up because they have not been able to get a consolidated owner or any money because it's partly held by corporations. So that building is in limbo. The people who live in that building are really suffering because they can't get the money to fix up the building because of this varied ownership structure. So sometimes it works to people's disadvantage. Any more questions? Yeah.
When they have not fixed up the building, what is the ratio of their heating costs compared to regular buildings? Twice it?
No idea. But I can tell you that the companies that do the styrofoam, the advertising campaigns they do are very creative. And I have some ads that a friend of mine picked up where it shows a panelak with a winter hat on the top, like a giant winter hat, to say that what this process does is warms up your, stops the escaping of the heat from the building. Like this idea of the coat or the hat. So I don't know how many of you have traveled extensively in the Czech Republic recently, but there are so few buildings comparatively, like very small percentage that don't have this renovation done now. It was the total opposite 15 years ago when I started to go very regularly. You would see it sometimes, but it was more rare. Now, it's very hard. The buildings that were the first panelaks, I photographed them one time before they got styrofoamed over. And I didn't even realize how critical that was. I actually saw what they looked like, and then they disappear because the styrofoam hides the entire tectonic of the facade. It just makes it a totally smooth building, and it's attached over top of the existing material. They don't take the facade off. They just drill into it and they attach the styrofoam. So it's relatively cheap. It's done by an industry that promotes itself, advertises everywhere. Sometimes on tower buildings, they sell the side of the building to let the company put a giant ad for their services on the side to make it cheaper. And so those become kind of billboard spaces. But I have no idea what the residents who don't have the fixed up buildings pay, but utility costs have gone up. And so in these municipal buildings, the ones that the city owns and in some places and hasn't fixed up, those people often are in social housing, subsidized housing. And so their heating costs are probably also subsidized, but I'm not sure about that. But if they're paying almost no rent. Those buildings, the rent control laws are very slowly changing. They just started to change. And people who are in those municipal buildings, they're paying really symbolic rent. Not anymore. Yeah, it's only in the last 3 years has it started to go up. And it's still only going up in percentages. It didn't just jump from subsidized to market. And so soon there will be no more the subsidies will go away. But there's an artificially low price for those social units, just like we have in our Section 8 kind of idea. Different context, but similar idea. So any more questions? Yeah.
You seem to mention that there were a few architects that were kind of not exactly with the sort of official.
Yeah.
But was there any actual sort of really consolidated different architectural school, and, you know, how did that go down?
Like a dissident architect?
Yeah, like dissident architects, where if you hadn't had socialism in Czechoslovakia, what would you have had?
It's a very complicated question, right? I think they call it the counterfactual, because you did have socialism, right? But, so one of the things that happens, particularly starting in the 70s, is that there is a kind of shadow industry of private homes being built outside of official time. So an architect could do something for a friend, and if they could get the materials on the black market, sometimes you give your own labor to the house. This is how some of the cooperatives worked. There's some experimental architecture that happens in this context of these private commissions outside of Stavопроjekt. But the architects doing those commissions, in every case I know, they had day jobs at Stavопроjekt. They didn't operate completely on these private commissions. There is the famous case of Skolka, which was in Liberec. So the Cial group that was inside of Stavопроjekt Liberec in the late 1960s. Some of you may know, like the television tower by Miroslav Masak. In the Mai building that was is now, I'm not sure what it is now, I think it's called May now, but the building that was Tesco for forever, and before that was Kmart. So there was let's call them a experimental group that formed inside of Stavопроjekt Liberec as a separate atelier to do experimental work in a few years in the 1960s when there was a more liberalizing kind of idea. And the Skolka was a architecture kindergarten. It was a place to train new architects. And a lot of the architects who ended up emigrating in the 70s, like John Eisner, some of you may have heard of, who went to work for Richard Meyer in California, he was part of the Skolka. And they were trying to be a kind of radical, not dissident, but a kind of radical group inside of the system. But they eventually had to give up because the system really clamped down on them. But there's wonderful books about Cial, also some of them in English, about the work they were able to do in the period from 64 to, I would say, 70, maybe 72. But you don't have a dissident architecture culture in Czechoslovakia. And there's many, many reasons for that, and it's also sort of complicated because some people would argue that the context of dissident, or the idea of dissident itself, is varied. So what it means to be a dissident is in architecture might not look like what it did for a playwright. But what happened was that architects retired, basically. They started to retreat. They taught at universities. They wrote books. They did historic preservation. Proha did preservation work at the end of his life. And so did Boguslav Fuchs, started to do kind of urban planning stuff and some preservation stuff. So they moved into domains in which the style of the architecture was a little bit less important. And they were also this avant-garde generation. They all started to either pass away or retire in the late 60s and into the 70s. Proha, this is one of the weird coincidences, life died the week that I was born in June 1974. And so he was active until that point. But there's not, behind that generation that had the avant-garde from the 30s, they were trained in the Stalinist period. The next generation was at university in the 40s and into the 50s. Some of them decided, like Hilsky and Antonín Tencer, these architects worked into the 70s, and some of them were really judged harshly by their colleagues. Like, they didn't retreat. They decided to keep building, especially Tencer, and when they become very old, they don't actually pass away until after communism. They're really judged harshly for not making more of a stand, let's say. But there's not a lot of architects around the Charter 77 group in the sort of dissident world. There's a few on the edges, but it was not at the center of architecture. I think it's partly because in order to be an architect, you had to work for the state. You couldn't just kind of, there wasn't a lot of paper architecture. In East Germany, there was some. I know some people doing research about that, but the Czechs and the Slovaks seem to, from what I know, stuck relatively close to working for the state and trying to be creative in their own context. Yeah.
Question. Are there any like real estimates for these different models, like how the lifespan of these? Because I come from Bratislava, so I know like a long time ago they were saying, oh, these are not going to last more than whatever years, and they're still there and very happy. And also, what are their like weaknesses? Like, is it those metal clips that are inside, you would say, or?
So, from a structural perspective, there's the issue of moisture and rotting out the steel, so that's one of the problems. The mortar disappeared and sort of went away, which is why, if you remember in the communist times, sometimes they'd fill the gap with this black color. That was a replacement for the mortar that had fallen away in the joints. A lot of plastics were used, and some of the plastics were experimental that had organic material in them, and that degrades over time, and so the plastic stuff is not always in great shape, and some of that was stoppers, like it was plastic pieces that they put in the gap between the panels. So, to be honest, this is not where I feel like I'm an expert to tell you, but I will say, in all the time I did all this research, and every archive I was in, and all the things I read, I never once saw a lifespan on a building. People always ask me, I heard these buildings were only supposed to be around for 20 years, or I heard these are only supposed to be around for 40 years. I never found that anywhere. And the post-89, the immediate early 90s stuff is talking about what are we going to do when these buildings are abandoned and collapse and people don't want to live in them. And it very quickly became clear that that wasn't going to happen, especially in the selling of the units to the residents. You know, people were able to buy their apartments for very little money. And one of the things I write about in my research now is how that housing infrastructure is actually propping up and holding together cities that economically shouldn't be as viable as they seem to be. Like Ostrava is in relatively good shape. And one of my arguments is that because people own their apartments there and have a stable network, they're more likely to stay there and try to economically be viable there, rather than trying to sell their apartment and move to Prague or somewhere where they can't afford to live. So in other words, the value that was transferred from the state to all these local residents in the selling for under market value of these apartments has provided stability in a lot of places. And you may disagree, but this is an observation that I've made, that there's this very stable housing infrastructure and people have very few costs related to their housing if they're owners, relative to an American kind of idea about how much it costs to buy and to maintain a place to live. So I think that the weaknesses are partly addressed with this styrofoaming process and the replacement of the roof, which is where most of the weaknesses that I've heard about, roofs like starting to cave in. If you replace them, the vertical facades are in pretty good shape from what I know. And I'm sure somebody in the building trade in the Czech Republic could tell you the intricate, or in Slovakia could tell you more intricate details, but when you see them doing this work, they are not working on the panels. They are working on screwing the new styrofoam onto the building. You know, if you look at all the scaffold and what they're doing, and they're very careful to put mesh and stucco on top of the styrofoam, and that makes all of the joints disappear. So if there's a weakness in the joint, it is now covered up. And so this sort of helps with that as well. The wrapping helps in a sense with that. Yeah. More questions? Probably you want to go.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks so much, Kimberly.
I'll have a little time to talk
You will have an opportunity to talk with Kimberly still. I would like to invite you to refreshments behind this wall, and let me also give you a head up, because one architectural one, because on 4th of